It all started as a love story that seemed perfect from the outside. James Parker was a devoted husband, deeply loved by his wife, Sarah. Together, they had built what everyone in their close-knit community saw as an ideal life. They had a beautiful home, 2 children, and a relationship that looked unbreakable. Sarah always trusted James completely. She believed in their love, their marriage, and the future they had built together. To their friends and family, they were the couple everyone looked up to. But behind closed doors, not everything was as perfect as it seemed. James was hiding something, a secret so dark that it would soon turn their lives upside down. What started as a harmless friendship with a colleague named Emily quickly spiraled into a forbidden love affair. This secret, hidden in the shadows of his seemingly perfect life, would soon lead to devastating consequences. James thought he could keep the affair hidden, but secrets have a way of coming out, and when they do, the damage is often irreversible. This story is not just about betrayal and lies, but how one man's choices can lead to a tragedy no one could have predicted. This is the story of how a husband's secret love affair ended in a brutal murder, shattering the lives of everyone involved. James Parker was a man who seemed to have it all: a loving wife, 2 children, and a stable, well-paying job. But sometimes, what appears to be enough from the outside isn't always enough for the person living it. That's when Emily Thompson entered his life. Emily was a young, attractive woman who worked alongside James at his office. At first, it was all innocent, a few laughs during lunch breaks, sharing jokes and work stories. James thought nothing of it, and to him, it was just a distraction from his daily routine. But as the days went by, those casual conversations turned into something more. James found himself thinking about Emily outside of work. Her smile, the way she listened to him, and the attention she gave him made him feel special in ways he hadn't felt in a long time. He began texting her after hours, something he had never done with any other colleague before. At first, it seemed harmless, just a bit of fun and harmless banter. But deep down, James knew that this was crossing a line, one he shouldn't be crossing. Soon, the texts became more frequent, and the flirting became more obvious. James couldn't resist the excitement Emily brought into his life. It was thrilling, something different from the routine of his marriage. He convinced himself it didn't mean anything serious, just a brief escape from reality. But what started as simple flirtation quickly grew into something much more dangerous. He began spending more time with Emily outside of work, finding excuses to meet her alone. The emotional bond between them strengthened, and before long, the affair had fully begun. As his relationship with Emily deepened, James started distancing himself from Sarah. He was more distracted at home, less interested in spending time with his family, and constantly checking his phone, hoping to hear from Emily. What he didn't realize, though, was how this secret would soon spiral out of control, leading him down a path he could never come back from. As James's affair with Emily grew deeper, the changes in him became more noticeable to those closest to him, especially Sarah. What once seemed like a perfectly happy marriage now felt distant and unfamiliar. Sarah had always trusted James completely, but lately, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was the little things at first: James coming home late more often, vague explanations about work meetings that ran longer than usual, and the constant buzzing of his phone, which he now guarded closely. Sarah found herself growing more anxious with each passing day. She noticed that James seemed distracted, often lost in his own thoughts, and no longer as engaged with their family as he used to be. He was spending more time on his phone, quickly locking it whenever she was nearby. At dinner, their conversations felt forced, and his once warm and loving gestures had turned cold. She tried to dismiss her worries, convincing herself that James was just stressed from work, but deep down her instincts told her something wasn't right. One evening, Sarah decided to confront James. She asked him directly if something was bothering him, hoping he would open up. But James was quick to reassure her with a nervous smile, saying that everything was fine. He blamed the long hours at work and tried to act as though nothing had changed. Still, Sarah wasn't convinced. His reassurances felt hollow, and her unease only grew stronger. Unable to silence the nagging doubts, Sarah began paying closer attention to James's behavior. She noticed that he had started stepping out to take phone calls, and there were messages on his phone that he seemed desperate to hide. The growing distance between them felt suffocating, and Sarah knew she had to dig deeper, even though she was terrified of what she might find. One night, after James had fallen asleep, Sarah took a bold step. Her hands trembled as she reached for his phone, heart racing with fear and anticipation. She had never imagined she'd be the kind of person to go through her husband's phone, but she needed answers. As she scrolled through his messages, her worst fears were confirmed. There were texts between James and Emily, messages filled with flirtation, affection, and plans to meet in secret. The reality of the affair hit her like a wave, leaving her breathless and devastated. Sarah's world began to crumble as she sat there in disbelief, staring at the phone screen. The man she loved, the father of her children, had been living a double life right under her nose. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have ever imagined. But as much as the truth hurt, Sarah knew this was just the beginning. What she didn't realize was that this discovery would soon set off a chain of events more dangerous and tragic than she could have ever predicted. After discovering the messages on James's phone, Sarah felt completely shattered. Her world, once filled with love and trust, was now crumbling under the weight of the affair she never saw coming. The betrayal was unbearable, and the emotional pain cut her deeper than anything she had ever experienced. Sarah had always believed in James, trusted him with her whole heart, but now, all she could feel was heartbreak and anger. For a few days, Sarah kept her discovery to herself, unsure of how to confront James. She played out countless scenarios in her head, wondering how he would react when faced with the truth. Would he deny it? Would he apologize? Could they ever move past this? The uncertainty was eating away at her, but one thing was clear. There was no going back from this. Her nights were sleepless, filled with thoughts of James sneaking around behind her back. Every loving moment they had shared now felt like a lie. She replayed every conversation, every moment of his distance, wondering how long he had been deceiving her. Her emotions swung between devastation and rage, between sadness and the urge to confront him right there and then. But she knew she had to gather her strength before taking the next step. Eventually, Sarah couldn't hold it in any longer. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, she sat down at the kitchen table, her heart pounding as she waited for James to come home. This time, she wouldn't ignore the signs or make excuses for his behavior. She had the proof, and there was no more denying the truth. When James walked through the door, she could barely hold back the flood of emotions building inside her. Without hesitation, Sarah confronted him. She laid out everything she had discovered, her voice trembling with both pain and anger. She showed him the messages, every text, every meeting they had planned, every betrayal that had taken place while she trusted him blindly. The moment the words left her mouth, the air between them grew heavy, thick with tension. James's face turned pale as he realized there was no hiding it anymore. At first, James tried to deny it, to brush it off as a misunderstanding. But Sarah had all the evidence in her hands. There was no escaping the truth now. Faced with no other option, James finally admitted to the affair. He stood there, speechless and ashamed, as the reality of his actions came crashing down. The excuses started pouring out. He blamed work stress, a moment of weakness, and a need for something different. But none of it mattered. The damage was done. For Sarah, hearing the truth from his own mouth felt like a knife to her heart. The man she thought she knew, the man she loved, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. She was filled with a whirlwind of emotions. Hurt, anger, sadness, and confusion. But amidst all the pain, one thing became clear. The trust between them was broken, and their life together would never be the same. Little did Sarah know, the confrontation that night would be only the beginning. This shocking discovery would ignite a series of events that neither of them could have ever predicted. Events that would ultimately lead to tragedy and an outcome far worse than anything she had imagined. The silence in the room was suffocating after James finally confessed to the affair. Sarah's world felt like it was spinning. Every part of her wanted to scream, to cry, to ask why. But instead, she just stood there, frozen, staring at the man who had broken her heart. James tried to explain himself, his voice shaky and filled with regret, but every word only made the betrayal feel deeper. Sarah, it wasn't supposed to be like this. It didn't mean anything, James stammered, his eyes pleading for understanding. He moved closer, reaching out to her, but Sarah backed away, refusing to let him get close. The pain and anger inside her were boiling over. How could he think this didn't matter? How could he have done this to her? Didn't mean anything? Sarah's voice cracked, her anger spilling out. You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around behind my back, destroying our family. And you say it didn't mean anything? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to be strong, even though every part of her felt like it was breaking. James was silent, his head hung low in shame. He had no words to defend himself because he knew there was nothing he could say to make this right. The weight of his actions was crashing down on him, and he realized just how much he stood to lose. Sarah, the love of his life, his children, their home, everything was slipping away, and it was all his fault. For Sarah, the hurt was too much to bear. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. James hesitated, not wanting to answer, but he knew he had to come clean. "A few months," he admitted quietly. The room felt even colder as the truth settled in. Months. All those nights he said he was working late, the times he seemed distant, all of it now made sense. Every moment felt like a lie, and Sarah couldn't take it anymore. Her anger flared again, and she lashed out, her voice rising with each word. "Was any of it real, James? Everything we've built, our family, our marriage, did any of it mean anything to you? Or was it all just a game?" James shook his head, his own emotions spilling over. "Of course it meant something, Sarah. I love you, I love our family. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but that doesn't mean I didn't care about us. I was confused. I lost my way." He was desperate, trying to salvage what little hope remained, but his words fell flat. The damage had been done. Sarah's hands trembled as she stood there, torn between the man she had loved for so many years and the man who had betrayed her. She didn't know what to believe anymore. "How could you do this to us? To me? To our children?" she asked, her voice breaking. "We trusted you, and you destroyed everything." James, realizing how close he was to losing everything, fell into a deep sense of regret. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll do anything to make this right. Please don't leave. Don't take the kids. We can fix this. I can fix this," he pleaded, tears welling up in his own eyes. But for Sarah, the trust was shattered. She couldn't imagine how they could ever move past this. The betrayal was too deep, the hurt too raw. "How do you fix something like this, James? How do you come back from something this broken?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew the answer, even if she didn't want to admit it. The room fell into a heavy silence once again, as both of them stood there, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. Sarah turned away, wiping her tears, feeling like she was suffocating in the weight of it all. She wanted to leave, to take her children and run far away from the pain. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. There were still too many pieces to pick up, too many things left unsaid. And the path ahead was only going to get darker. That night marked the beginning of the end. The confrontation had torn open wounds that could never heal, and the consequences of that evening would soon spiral out of control, leading to a tragedy no one could have predicted. In the days that followed the devastating confrontation, the atmosphere in the Parker household was heavy with tension. Sarah couldn't bring herself to look at James the same way anymore. Everything about him reminded her of the betrayal, of the lies that had torn her world apart. She tried to focus on her children, on maintaining some sense of normalcy for their sake, but inside, she was broken. James, on the other hand, was desperate to fix what he had destroyed. He knew he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, but he clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild. He apologized constantly, tried to make amends by being more present with the family, but Sarah remained distant, her heart too wounded to accept his efforts. Every time he tried to talk to her, the conversation quickly turned tense, with Sarah pulling further away. At work, things weren't much better for James. His affair with Emily had become more than just a secret. It had become a burden. Emily, now feeling the strain of being the other woman, wanted more from James. She wasn't content with being kept in the shadows any longer. She pressed him to make a decision, to either leave Sarah and be with her or risk everything coming to light. James was trapped between two worlds. On one side, there was Sarah, his wife, and the life they had built together, the life he desperately wanted to hold on to. On the other side was Emily, the woman he had fallen into an affair with, the one who had brought excitement back into his life, but at the cost of everything he held dear. Emily wasn't going to wait forever. She made it clear that if James didn't make up his mind soon, she would take matters in her own hands and expose their affair to everyone, including Sarah. The pressure was building. Every day, James felt the walls closing in. He knew he couldn't keep living this double life, but he couldn't bring himself to make the decision either. The guilt, the fear, and the constant stress were becoming unbearable. Sarah was slipping further away from him, and Emily was growing impatient. James's once orderly life was now in complete chaos. At home, Sarah began to question what the future held for her and the children. Could she ever forgive James? Could their marriage survive this? Every time she looked at him, all she saw was the betrayal. But there were the children to consider. She didn't want to rip their lives apart, but she also couldn't pretend everything was fine. The conflict inside her was tearing her apart. She had moments where she considered leaving, packing her things, and taking the kids far away from the pain, but she still hadn't made a final decision. And then there was Emily. Unbeknownst to Sarah, Emily was growing more and more demanding. She wasn't content with being a secret anymore. She wanted James all to herself, and she wasn't going to let him back out. She knew too much, and James knew that if Emily followed through on her threats, it would be the end of everything. His career, his family, his reputation, it would all go up in flames. As the days dragged on, the pressure mounted on James from all sides. He was living in a nightmare of his own making, and the choices he had to face were impossible. No matter what he did, someone would be hurt, and his life would never be the same. Little did he know, the decisions he would soon make would not just hurt the people he loved. They would lead to something far worse than he ever imagined. The fallout from the affair was spiraling out of control, and the consequences were growing darker with each passing day. James could feel it, looming just over the horizon, a storm that was about to hit, and when it did, everything would be destroyed. As the pressure mounted, James found himself at a breaking point. Every aspect of his life was falling apart, and he could no longer ignore the chaos he had created. Sarah was distant, their marriage barely holding on by a thread. Emily was relentless, pushing harder each day for him to leave his wife and commit to her. He was trapped between two impossible choices: stay and try to salvage what was left of his marriage, or leave everything behind and start a new life with Emily. But deep down, James knew neither option would save him from the inevitable disaster his actions had set in motion. Emily's threats grew more intense. She wasn't going to be his secret any longer. She wanted him to make a choice, and she made it clear that if he didn't, she would expose everything. The fear of losing everything, his family, his reputation, his career, gripped James. The stakes were higher than ever, and he couldn't see a way out. Emily's ultimatum haunted him day and night, her words echoing in his mind. "Leave Sarah, or I will tell her everything." One evening, unable to bear the weight of it all, James made a decision that would change everything. He agreed to meet Emily, telling himself that he would finally end things. He had convinced himself that this was the only way to save his marriage, to stop the spiral of lies and betrayal that had consumed his life. But what James didn't realize was that this meeting would be far from a simple conversation. It would become the turning point in a nightmare that would soon spiral out of control. As James arrived at the secluded spot where he had arranged to meet Emily, the tension in the air was thick. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing as he tried to prepare himself for what was to come. He told himself he would calmly explain to Emily that it was over, that he couldn't leave his family, and that their affair had to end. But when Emily arrived, the confrontation was anything but calm. Emily was furious. She had been waiting for weeks, expecting James to leave Sarah, to finally choose her. Now, standing in front of him, she felt betrayed. She had risked everything for him, and now he was backing out. The conversation quickly escalated. Emily's voice was sharp, filled with anger and desperation. She demanded answers. She wanted to know why he had led her on, why he had made promises he couldn't keep. Her emotions were raw, and she didn't hold back. She threatened him again, reminding him that if he didn't leave Sarah, she would expose everything: his affair, his lies, his betrayal. James tried to reason with her, but Emily wasn't listening. She was too hurt, too angry. The situation was spiraling out of control, and James could feel himself losing grip on the moment. His frustration grew, and in the heat of the moment, something inside him snapped. It was as if all the pressure, the fear, and the guilt he had been carrying exploded in that instant. In a blind rage, James lashed out. What happened next was a blur. James acted on impulse, not thinking about the consequences, not realizing the severity of his actions until it was too late. Emily fought back, struggling to escape, but James's anger had overtaken him. In a matter of minutes, the situation turned deadly. Emily lay motionless, her life taken in a violent, tragic outburst. The realization of what he had done hit James like a tidal wave. His hands shook as he stared at Emily's lifeless body. The silence that followed was deafening, and James could feel the weight of his actions crashing down on him. There was no going back now. What had started as a simple affair, a moment of weakness, had led to this brutal murder. James stood there, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't meant for it to end this way. But it was too late. The decision he had made in that moment of rage had sealed his fate, and the consequences would be far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. In the aftermath of Emily's death, James was left standing alone, frozen in shock at the horrific scene before him. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the gravity of what had just happened. It had all escalated so quickly. One moment he was arguing with Emily, and the next she was gone. Her lifeless body lay on the ground, a brutal reminder of the terrible mistake he had made. James's heart pounded in his chest, the reality of his actions sinking in. Panic set in almost immediately. He knew what he had done was unforgivable. He couldn't stay there. His first instinct was to run, to get as far away from the scene as possible. But the weight of the situation kept pulling him back. His mind was a blur of fear and confusion. What was he going to do now? How could he possibly hide something this terrible? In a desperate attempt to cover his tracks, James began cleaning up the scene. He wiped down any evidence of his presence, trying to erase the signs of the struggle. He moved quickly, but his hands trembled with fear, and every sound around him seemed amplified, as if the world itself was closing in on him. It felt impossible to think clearly, but he knew he had to get away before anyone found out. After what felt like an eternity, James left the scene, his heart still racing as he drove away. But no matter how fast he fled, there was no escaping what had just happened. Every moment replayed in his mind. The argument, the violence, Emily's lifeless body. He couldn't escape the crushing guilt that now weighed heavily on him. His life had changed forever, and deep down, James knew it was only a matter of time before the truth caught up with him. The next morning, news of Emily's death sent shockwaves through the community. A jogger had found her body, and the police were immediately called to the scene. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that this was no accident. The signs of foul play were obvious, and the police quickly launched an investigation. The once quiet and peaceful town was now gripped by the news of a brutal murder, and rumors began to swirl as people wondered who could have committed such a heinous crime. James, meanwhile, tried to act as if nothing had happened. He returned to his normal routine, attempting to mask his growing fear with a facade of calm. But inside, he was unraveling. Every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock at the door, James's heart raced, terrified that it was the police coming for him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight, haunted by the reality of what he had done. He avoided eye contact with Sarah, unable to face the guilt that was now consuming him. As the investigation progressed, the police began piecing together the events that led to Emily's death. It didn't take long for them to discover her connection to James. They found out about the affair through her phone records and messages. The once secret relationship was now out in the open, and James quickly became the prime suspect. The noose was tightening, and there was nowhere left for James to hide. The investigation was closing in, and with each passing day, James knew that his time was running out. He had crossed a line that could never be undone, and the consequences were catching up to him. The weight of his actions bore down on him like a crushing force, but the worst was yet to come. The truth was about to be revealed, and when it did, it would destroy everything. The moment James had been dreading finally came. Just a few days after Emily's body was discovered, the police knocked on his door. Sarah, unaware of the full extent of what was happening, answered, and within moments, everything unraveled. James stood frozen as the officers informed him that they had questions about his relationship with Emily Thompson. He tried to remain calm, but the guilt weighed too heavily on him. His carefully crafted lies, the attempts to distance himself from the crime, were all beginning to fall apart. The investigation had moved quickly. The police had found Emily's phone, and it contained everything: texts, calls, meeting arrangements, all the evidence linking James to her. There was no denying the affair now. The detectives were thorough, and soon they connected the dots, from James's suspicious behavior to his involvement in her death. As they took him into custody, James could feel the walls closing in. The life he had tried so hard to protect, the family he had clung to, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As James was led away in handcuffs, Sarah stood in shock. The truth, which had been slowly unraveling, hit her like a wave. The affair, the lies, and now this, her husband was being arrested for murder. She couldn't believe what was happening, couldn't understand how the man she had loved and trusted for so many years had become someone capable of such horrific acts. Everything she knew about her life, her marriage, had been shattered in an instant. The trial that followed was a media sensation. The story of the once-respected husband, caught in a deadly love triangle that ended in murder, captivated the public. News outlets covered every detail, from the affair's discovery to the tragic end of Emily's life. In court, James looked like a shell of the man he once was, weighed down by the reality of what he had done. His lawyer tried to argue that the murder had been a crime of passion, an unplanned act committed in a moment of rage, but the prosecution painted a different picture. They described James as a man who, faced with losing everything, chose to silence Emily in the most violent way possible. Sarah, who had tried to stay strong through it all, was called to testify. Her heart broke as she took the stand, recounting the moment she discovered James's affair, the way their marriage had fallen apart, and how she had never imagined it would lead to something so tragic. Her pain was palpable, and the courtroom sat in silence as she spoke. The betrayal still cut deep, and the knowledge that James's actions had led to Emily's death weighed heavily on her. She wasn't just mourning the loss of her marriage. She was grappling with the fact that her husband had taken someone's life. The trial dragged on for weeks, with every detail of James's affair and the motive involved. Witnesses testified, evidence was presented, and each day, a case against Emily. In the end, this is a story about the fragility of trust and the heavy cost of betrayal. A husband's secret love affair, kept hidden for too long, ended in tragedy. A tragedy that could have been avoided had he chosen honesty over deceit, responsibility over selfishness. The ripple effects of that one decision will echo for years to come, serving as a sobering lesson about the consequences of our actions. As we reflect on the events that led to this devastating outcome, we are reminded of how quickly life can change and how the choices we make, no matter how small, can have life-altering consequences. James Parker's story is a tragic one, and it leaves us with a haunting question. What could have been different if he had chosen another path?